Thank you for joining us for Sree's special election coverage, the latest news, analysis, and special guests. Our host, of course, is Sree Sreenivasan from New York City. Mary C. Curtis joins us from North Carolina as our political analyst. And the guest on this show is Brandon Jones, SPLC Action Fund Director of Political Campaigns. Sree's special election coverage is produced by Neil Parekh for Digimentors in partnership with Scroll and Scroll Global, one of India's most important websites. We have a number of shows planned for this week. We did one yesterday evening, Eastern Time. We have several shows tomorrow at for on election day at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and then a special show at 11 p.m. Eastern with Indian Express. We will also be on the air on Wednesday morning, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time. You can find all of these shows and details on our website, digimentors.group/election 2024. You can find live coverage and past shows. Yesterday, our guest was Cliff Albright from Black Voters Matter. And as I mentioned earlier, at 11 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday night, tomorrow, 9:30 a.m. Indian Standard Time, we will be producing a special show for the Indian Express. Live from New York, America Decides. These shows are produced by Digimentors, a social digital events AI consultancy founded by Sree Sreenivasan and Andrew Lee. Again, our guest for this show is Brandon Jones, Director of Political Campaigns with the SPLC Action Fund. That's the Southern Poverty Law Center Action Fund. Mary C. Curtis, a CQ roll call columnist and Equal Time podcast host, is our political analyst. And our host, of course, is Sree Sreenivasan. He is a New York City-based journalist. We're live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our Digimentors website and Instagram. We're also live on two of Scroll's channels, Facebook and YouTube. Thank you to everyone watching on Scroll. Now, without further ado, let's bring on our host, Sree Sreenivasan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Election Eve coverage on Scroll and Scroll Global. I'm so delighted that you are all with us, watching us live or later. We're on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and on digimentors.group. We want you to tag a friend, anyone who would be interested in understanding what's going on with the elections. We want you to tag them. They can watch us live or watch us later. I know some of you are watching in India. Many of you are watching in India, where it's already election day, Tuesday, but here it's election eve, Monday, when we are coming live to you. We are so delighted that we can bring you coverage where we can spend time understanding the issues, not just discussing them and just having people shout at each other, but we want to help you understand what's happening with this election and what it means in the United States. We are focusing, we'll of course look at the presidential elections, but we're focusing especially on what we call the down ballot races. That means other seats that are up for grabs. You know, the Senate, you know, the House of Representatives, but there are so many other elections that are happening across the United States. One thing that so many people are asking me is, when will we know? Will we know on Tuesday night in the US? And the answer is, we don't know if we'll know, because in some election years, by about 11 p.m. Eastern Time, we do know who has won. In other years, it has taken a day or two. With Biden's election in 2020, it took all the way till Saturday to know who had won the election. And if anyone tells you that they know what's happening with this election, they are not being truthful, because nobody knows. The presidential election is a toss-up. All the latest polls tell us that. Now it's all about turnout. And we will be trying to understand what are the things that drive turnout, and how will we know how the election is going, and when will we know it? One of the things that I try to remind people is that in the 2020 election, Joe Biden got 81 million votes. Donald Trump got 74 million votes, but 64 million people didn't vote. 64 million people didn't vote in an election that was decided by a few hundred votes in the different election places in the major swing states. So turnout matters, and the chance to have an impact in this election matters based on how people decide to vote. They've been inundated by ads, and there's so much going on, but we're going to help you understand all of it. Just a reminder that this is just one of the many shows we're doing, and we're going to show you once more so you can tell your friends and you can be ready. We're now on the Monday 9 p.m. show in the US. That means it's Tuesday at 7:30 a.m. in India already. And then on election day, we will be live at noon in Eastern time, which will be about 10:30 p.m. in India. And then we will be live at 9 p.m. Tuesday in the US, which will be, of course, 7:30 a.m. in India. And those are the shows on Scroll. And on Tuesday night at 11 p.m., right about that time when we may start to really understand who's ahead in this election, we will have live from New York, America Decides on the Indian Express. So please join us for that show as well. So right now, what you can do is tag your friends and tell them to watch. Let's see who is watching. Jonathan Borstein is watching. Greetings from New York. Diana Rohini is watching from the San Francisco Bay Area. Welcome. Sudha Parekh is watching from from Hastings on Hudson. And Paula Kiger is watching from Tallahassee, Florida. Thank you, Brandon and team, for what you and SPLC do. And hello, Mary, grateful for so many who care about the fate of our democracy. I think with that, we are ready to bring in our guest, Brandon, and to hear from him at this moment about what is happening with the elections and to understand the state of the race. Brandon Jones is Director of Political Campaigns for the SPLC Action Fund, part of the Southern Poverty Law Center, one of the most important civil rights and social justice organizations in the United States. Please welcome Brandon Jones.
Hey, Sree. Very good to be with you.
Thank you for listening to that preamble. We want to make sure that as many people can tune in and be with us at this moment. Tell us where you're calling in from and what has been your day like already.
I'm calling in from just outside of Jackson, Mississippi, in the Deep South. Of course, we are the Southern Poverty Law Center, so we are focused on the Deep South states. And today has been a lot of concern over the counting of absentee ballots. This is a constant challenge and issue in the states that we provide service for. And our focus this afternoon and this evening has been Cobb County. In fact, I'm hopeful that we won't be interrupted during tonight's conversation with chatter from my colleagues who have been in and out of the courtroom over the last several days, trying to make sure that everyone who qualifies to vote absentee gets a ballot and that there's enough time to return those ballots. So, you know, we see these issues throughout our states, and it never ends. And of course, here at election time, we're very attentive to those issues.
I understand that completely. Let's see. Roman's watching from Santo Domingo. Hello, Roman. Dan's watching from New Jersey. And these folks who are watching all over the world right now, they're trying to understand this U.S. election. So first, let's take a step back. Tell us about the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's an unusual name. I am honored that me and my team can work with the SPLC and your amazing leadership. But explain, please, the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Well, thank you for your support of our organization. It's been a good partnership. Especially appreciated you and your team's support of our 50-year anniversary. Yeah, so the Southern Poverty Law Center has been around for over 50 years, as you mentioned a moment ago, primarily civil rights organization. We really cut our teeth filing lawsuits against the Ku Klux Klan. And we're operating for the most part for many of our early 50 years as a law firm. We about 10 years ago decided that it wasn't enough to simply file lawsuits. We wanted to affect policy in the states where we serve. So we developed policy teams that would lobby different state legislatures. Here in recent years, that has grown to a presence on Capitol Hill, Washington, D.C. So we have a very large policy department that has worked inside of the state houses where we are, working closely with legislators to try to stop bad laws and try to expand voting rights. And then increasingly there in Washington, D.C., trying to work on federal law. But we realized in these last several years, again, it's not enough to file lawsuits. It's not enough to simply lobby. We realized we had to get more engaged in the political process. And so you mentioned the SPLC Action Fund. That is our 501c4. And through that organization, we will endorse candidates for office, and we will do a lot of voter education. We work on some of these issues that I mentioned a moment ago, these ballot issues. And we've also started some different political entities, the New Southern Majority, which is our independent expenditure PAC or super PAC, where we run independent expenditure operations on behalf of local candidates, and New Southern Leaders, where we work with candidates to help both recruit and to train and prepare people to serve. And look, we realized for some time that some of the issues that affect people most, some of the political decisions that are made that have the biggest impact on people's lives are made by those people who hold these local offices, people who are in places like the school board or the sheriff. Even jobs like county coroner have so much of an impact on our justice system and how civil rights are meted out at the local level. And we realized there was a big gap in terms of supporting good people for these offices and helping to recruit them and to run campaigns on their behalf. And so that's really been a focus of ours. As you can see on the screen, in the 5 states where we serve, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, and Georgia, we've endorsed over 30 candidates this year. Those jobs have ranged from Supreme Court offices all the way to city council and school board members. There are 3 federal offices that I don't know how many of our readers can make out all the names on the list. Really just wanted to demonstrate where we were, but I should mention we did endorse Vice President Harris for the presidency, and we endorsed 2 congressional candidates, one in Louisiana's 6th district and one in Alabama's 2nd district. Those are very meaningful to us because these are places where the SPLC and other people brought lawsuits to create new congressional districts, because these are places that had been suppressing the Black voter participation. And so these are 2 very newly created Black majority districts in the heart of Louisiana and Alabama. And we're very pleased to now be providing political support to the nominees there. So as you can see, we've been busy and we're excited about the work we're doing.
Thank you for the work you're doing. I was just looking at that list. It's pretty amazing that jobs like coroner, the person who certifies debts and investigates debts, is a political position in many states in in America. This is one of the many complicated things about America that international folks will never understand. But give us a reason why these sort of jobs that in other countries would be just part of the government bureaucracy at every level, they have these, and therefore they become political once they're up for office, if they can be elected. And you did mention the Supreme Court, so just to clarify, this is the state Supreme Courts that you're talking about. There is the United States Supreme Court, SCOTUS, as they say, Supreme Court of the United States. That's the one international folks are familiar with, as well as most Americans. But in some of these other states, the lower level version of the Supreme Court is an elected position, adding to the confusion.
I'm sympathetic to our international friends trying to understand the patchwork quilt of laws and positions in our states. In the United States, each state operates somewhat independently in how they mete out the different offices. And so there are places within the United States where some of these jobs are appointed, but in others, they're elected. We also have a lot of fun, Sree, trying to figure out when the different voting times are. Of the states I just mentioned to you, 2 of them elect their local officials at the same time as federal elections, and 3 of them elect most of their local officials in other years. And so Mississippi and Louisiana had their state and local elections last year. Alabama will have their municipal elections next year. So there's a lot to sort out. But, we've examined each of these offices. And it's not just people who are looking at this from the outside, I should say. There are people who are served by these jobs who are not exactly sure what they do. And so part of what we have been doing is a voter education piece to make sure that the people in these areas understand and appreciate what the roles and responsibilities are. You mentioned coroner. That might strike people as an unusual elected position. It is elected in Georgia, and it's increasingly important in how criminal justice decisions are made in the aftermath of violent crimes, and how different decisions can be made that get the system moving in one direction or the other. And so you need thoughtful, responsible, qualified people in that role. And part of what we've been doing is raising awareness around jobs like that and some of those others that you mentioned.
Thank you, folks. That's Brandon Jones. I'm Sree Sreenivasan. We're talking about the U.S. elections. I see Apollo is watching from Pennsylvania, and Nikita is watching from Maryland. She's an Indian watching from Maryland. Thank you for watching wherever you are. Tell us what your questions are. We have an expert here, and we're going to be joined in just a moment by Mary C. Curtis, who is a columnist, commentator, and also political journalist. So she will help us figure all this stuff out. There's so much going on, Brandon. And so what are the things that you're going to be looking for on election night that affect the things that you're worried about, but also the general overall patterns, and what's going to happen tomorrow during the day?
Yeah, there are 2 states that I think are relevant to our work at the local level, but also have ramifications for some of these issues that are making national waves. One that's very obvious, of course, one of our swing states in our country is Georgia. It's an emerging purple state that has a lot of focus on it. We mentioned some of these local jobs. 2 of those that we're working on are in Cobb County, and I would define Cobb County as a swing county and a swing state. The school board there is the 3rd largest in the state. Has been sort of the tip of the spear for some of the book bans that people may have heard of, some of the issues around teaching of real history, things of that nature. And so we're happy to be supporting Laura Judge and Andrew Cole for the school board there. And what you learn when you bring people out for local races in a place like Cobb County, obviously those voters also participate at the top of the ticket. So we're hopeful that the work that we're doing on the local level to encourage people to participate in their school board election encourages them to vote at the federal level. So we'll have our eyes on Cobb County and the other 6 counties that are in that Atlanta metro area to get a sense of where Georgia is going to land. Georgia will be among one of the first swing states that we get results from. And so we'll be looking there. And then down in Florida, people may remember Florida is a former swing state, a place that used to be kind of the center of the political universe in the United States, has since that time become increasingly red. But there is a abortion measure that's on the ballot there that we will be paying attention to, in addition to school board races there.
Thank you. We have so many questions and comments coming in. Vikram is watching from Fremont. Diana says, agree with Brandon on the school board races. Even in our very blue state, California, we're seeing extremists running for school boards. A group of us started Lift Up Public Schools to fight this wave of ultra-right from winning these important down ballot races. Thank you for bringing these issues up in this coverage. And Linda is watching from New York 19, where it looks like we may retake our House seat. Go Josh Riley, she says. So on that note, let's bring in our dear friend, Mary C. Curtis, who is a commentator. She is a columnist for CQ and the host of the podcast Equal Time, which I want everyone to sign up for. Please find her, please follow her, and please welcome Mary C. Curtis.
Thank you. It's great being here, and it's great listening to Brandon. I'm based in another southern state, North Carolina, where we have a lot of down ballot races. One in particular is the superintendent of public instruction, which would be in charge of all of the public schools and the budgeting. And one of the Republican candidate, Michelle Morrow, beat the present superintendent of public instruction, who was a Republican, but pretty bipartisan. And she's running against Mo Green, who has been a superintendent in the state. But Michelle Morrow actually has not, she doesn't have any experience in the public schools. She did not send her children to public schools. And she has made quite a few incendiary comments that are very threatening to former President Barack Obama, talking about he should be publicly executed and so many of these things. And so this is a person who will be in charge of public schools. She has said that Satan is in the public schools and they are infecting children's minds. So yes, these races are important. I did want to ask Brandon, when he mentioned the two House races with the newly drawn districts for representation in, I believe, Louisiana and Alabama. And really, how difficult is it? And what do you do to try to incentivize folks to vote, whose vote really, their votes haven't mattered pretty much for so many years. And now you're saying, wow, you have a chance to elect someone to represent you. How tough of a job is that? And what do you do to get folks to vote and say, this is in your great interest?
Thank you, Mary. It's a great question. I'm sure as many of our viewers know from across the country, we are just an increasingly gerrymandered patchwork of congressional districts. And so it's not uncommon for people to participate in an election where the winner is kind of decided in the primary. These two places that we're talking about, Louisiana 6 and Alabama 2, are two places where Black voters in these districts have had very little in the way of competitive elections for many, many decades. And so part of the task that we have whenever you have a newly drawn district truly is voter education. It's going to people and making them aware you have a new congressional district. The way that it's comprised is more representative of who you are and who this region is, and your vote does count. And so we've spent an incredible amount of time simply reaching out to voters, making sure they're aware of the change, making sure that they understand the geographic boundary that now exists. In the case of Alabama, this district now runs from Mobile on the Gulf Coast all the way up to Montgomery, there, the capital. And so making sure that people are aware of the region, making sure that they know that their vote really does count, and that this year, as opposed to other years, they might actually help to elect a congressperson. It's also meaningful in these two places because a couple years ago, these are two parts of the country that had the lowest voter participation in our midterms. And it goes right back to the point you were making. When people think that their vote will have no impact on the outcome of the race, it's very hard to get them out. So that's been part of the job, is to urge them to participate and to recognize that their vote does count, and their vote could be very meaningful to deciding the composition of Congress.
Do you think that having a woman of color on the top of the ticket for the Democrats will also serve as an incentive, even though obviously these states are probably not going to go blue? Have you found that when you're talking to folks that they see that as pretty inspirational, particularly in states that, of course, have a history of voter suppression, and even, they had to have the Voting Rights Act passed before people could actually vote without facing violence?
No, that's absolutely right. Yeah, we have seen that. I know people are ready to get off the polar coaster, and we're all just inundated with different polls and have been dealing with that for several weeks here in the United States. But we polled in Alabama prior to the switch, whenever President Biden looked to be the nominee. And then we went back out into the field and polled this district after Vice President Harris became the nominee. And we noticed a nearly 12-point swing in voter enthusiasm. And that's before any ads ran. That was before any of the campaigns were doing any serious voter communication. So we saw the impact and the enthusiasm that you're referring to. And it lifts all boats. To your point, not only were people excited about Vice President Harris, they also had renewed interest in the congressional race. They were interested in Shamari Figures, who's the candidate running there. And so there's no question it makes a big difference. And another thing that I think is notable is we're seeing a gender gap across the country. As you look at who is participating in the early vote, by the last number I saw, I think nationally of the millions of people who have already voted, women make up that group by greater than 7%. 7% advantage for women. And it's even larger in some places. In some of our swing states, it's as high as double digits. I don't think there's any question that having a woman at the top of the ticket has to mean something. But I think, as organizations like ours tend to remind people, there's also a backlash. Sexism is real. Racism is real. And in the same way that her identity can be a motivating factor for some, we have to be honest and recognize it can also be a motivating factor for those who are not inclined to vote for a Black person, who don't want to see a woman in the White House. And believe it or not, those people are out there.
Oh, definitely. And have you seen any kind of indications of voter suppression at the polls? I know Neil has some articles that we pulled up about efforts, since the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we saw that many states had to have federal election monitors come into the states to make sure that everybody was getting their right to vote. Because there was a backlash. And then we saw in 2013 when the Supreme Court invalidated many of these provisions that they had to clear certain of their voting rules in the Shelby case, that some of these rules and restrictions have come back. And we see even in states like Texas and Florida, as you would expect, that they're saying that federal election monitors cannot come into the polling places because they feel they're doing a good enough job. And others are saying, they actually have federal election monitors going into some counties because there have been complaints. Do you see this, Brandon, in some of your states that you cover, that you have to combat some of these efforts at discouraging or even intimidating voters of color?
We do. We absolutely do. I mean, and we have to, I think, expand our definition of how voter intimidation can work. A lot of the voter intimidation that has occurred across our states occurred in the state legislature in the years running up to this election. Things that make it harder for people to vote. In Mississippi, a person who wants to vote absentee must give a reason for not being there on election day. There's no such thing as no excuse early voting. And then if they do it by mail, they must have the application for a ballot notarized. And then whenever they turn that ballot in, it must be notarized again. Imagine trying to navigate that if you're a college student or someone that's elderly or someone that doesn't have access to a notary. And then we have laws that have been passed that limit the amount of assistance people can get in the voting process. So if someone has health or other concerns, it prevents some of the assistance they might have. In Georgia, we've seen laws that prevent people from giving a bottle of water to someone who is in a long line. And we all know those lines can be long. But then they're also working it from the other side by reducing the number of places where people can vote. This week and tonight, we're dealing with an issue in Cobb County, Georgia, where the local election board there failed to get out absentee ballots to 3,500 voters who requested them. And then whenever we sought to have the deadline extended so that those people could have adequate time to return the ballot, the GOP intervened. And tonight a judge said they're going with the GOP and those ballots must be in by 7 p.m. tomorrow. Well, how on earth do you pull that off? So we're scrambling tonight to contact the friends and family and those individuals to try to make sure they know their rights and to try to get their ballot and get their votes counted. So those are just some of the examples of the run up to election day. No question there will be other examples tomorrow. But I do want to say, Mary, too, I'm so thankful for the organizations across our region and throughout the country who are working against those types of efforts, who are providing election protection. There are people who are on standby to try to assist people to try to make sure they have the resources they need. And I hope the people listening to this who are going to participate in elections tomorrow, yes, there are forces at work to try to stifle the vote. And there are certainly people who are doing things that make it harder to vote. But keep in mind, there are also people who are working to try to make it as safe as possible and to assist you if you run into an issue. And you mentioned a moment ago the Department of Justice trying to send people out to provide it, just a watchful eye in areas that have had traditional challenges. I think it was the right idea. But as you mentioned too, since 2013 and the decision in Shelby, those types of interventions have been harder and harder.
Yeah.
Okay, we have lots of questions and comments coming in. Thank you so much. That's Mary C. Curtis from North Carolina. That's Brandon Jones from SPLC, who is in Mississippi. We're so grateful to all of you for being here and for watching. We have a question. Nikita is asking, what are the swing state stances looking like for this election? So what I want to do is first explain what a swing state is to everyone who's watching. This is a website called 270 to Win. And what it does is it shows you the swing states by, those are the ones that are in this tan color, right? So you can see the number of states that are already solid red or leaning red. You can see Iowa, Ohio, for example. And then blue, dark blue means solid Democratic, and then light blue is leaning Democratic. And then these tan ones decide where the election is going to be with the president. So the question was trying to understand on the presidential level, but also on the local level. So maybe Brandon, you can explain a little bit about, the impact that the presidential level, election can have on the down ballot races in these swing states. People who may not go to vote might be excited about a big presidential election versus what we call the midterms, as we had in 2022, rather than in 2020 or now in 2024. So if you can explain some of that, that would be great. And I want to hear from Mary as well.
I'm a big fan of these states that allow their federal and local races to be on the ballot at the same time. Sree, you're exactly right. It drives people out in a way that nothing else does. And so it just creates an opportunity for you to talk to people about these down ballot races in a way that you don't get in a typical election year. As someone who has tried to drag people out for a standalone circuit court race or school board race at a time when nothing else is on the ballot, I can tell you that can be very challenging. It becomes a lot easier when you have a big presidential election drawing people out. I would just say about this map, as you noted, we've identified 7 states that meet the definition of what Sree mentioned a moment ago. You see a couple of those in the South. You see a few of them in the North, and then you have 2 over in the Sun Belt. And I have no doubt we'll all be watching those very closely. I noticed, though, Mary, that the 2 in the South, the Georgia and North Carolina, the expectation is that we might get results a little bit sooner in those places this time. Maybe so, maybe not. But the way that they're going to count is a little bit different from 4 years ago. But anyway, those will be some states that we'll be looking for early on.
Yeah, I'm looking at that tan North Carolina. When you talk about down ballot, we have that big wild card that everyone's heard of, who's Mark Robinson, the Republican running for governor, who had CNN reported these texts and things that were found. But even before that, he had some very incendiary comments about abortion rights, where he said very insulting things about women. I really feel like I can't even say half the things he said. And in the polling now, he is running far, far behind the current Attorney General, Josh Stein, who is running for governor. And of course, there's some folks wondering, will there be reverse coattails? Because in the presidential level, it's very much tied. And we see that Donald Trump was again in North Carolina today, because I feel like he really needs those 16 electoral votes. Kamala Harris, the vice president, would love to have those. She doesn't. She has other paths. He does as well, but it would be much more difficult if he loses North Carolina, which was his narrowest win in in 2020. Yes, in 2020. It was as narrow as, it was like a little bit over 1%. But North Carolina has not gone for a Democratic president since 2008, Barack Obama. So that is one where they're hoping, actually, and wondering if a down ballot race will have an effect on the rest of the ticket, and if that will help all the rest of the Democrats who are running for everything from public instruction and so forth. But we also have seen Hurricane Helene. How will that have an effect? Because we've seen really strong voting. It's stronger than the last election, even though they had to make some accommodations because the polling sites and precincts have been changed or destroyed. So that's kind of interesting. And we have seen our court strike down some things that Republicans tried to do. They tried to strike 225,000 people off the rolls who they said might be non-citizens. They said, well, it's too close, you can't do that. And we have seen some signs in polling places that had to be taken down that said in Spanish, if you are not a citizen, you can go to jail for voting. That is true in a sense, of course, but it also was thought of as voter intimidation since these signs were only in Spanish. So as Brandon attested, since the repeal of some of the provisions in the Voting Rights Act, we've seen all of these kinds of tactics, which we didn't see when states had to pre-clear any change in their voting rules and regulations with the federal government before they could take place. It's almost like you're playing whack-a-mole, trying to hit that. And groups like Brandon's are trying to provide other paths to make sure folks' votes get counted.
A Virginia principal went to vote. She was asked whether she was a citizen. The incident played out as Donald Trump and many Republicans are falsely claiming that waves of non-citizens are voting. And so they're eyeballing people and then deciding to ask, which is just so ridiculous. Aisha Sultan, the very well-known, distinguished columnist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, has a comment here, not in a swing state, but a very, very important ballot initiative that would overturn Missouri's near total abortion ban. Down ballot matters. And so you are seeing, as Mary and Brandon have explained, that you can have something that's, you know, for some things, the top of the ticket kind of drags everybody over and gives incentive. And then sometimes it's the other way around, from the lower parts of the ticket. And these initiatives are also so important. Brandon, talk a little bit about that, please, and explain to folks how these tickets, how these initiatives matter. People have perhaps heard of ones in California. Famously, California has a lot of citizen initiatives, but they have them in many states, most states, all states.
Yeah. I wish we had them in all states, but no, these ballot initiatives are a form of direct democracy. And, you know, we're all familiar with how Congress is gerrymandered, that word we use to say it gets kind of drawn to favor one party or another. Our state legislatures are drawn much the same way. And so in many cases, there can be very good legislation that just can't get purchased because the legislature is so extreme. Missouri is an example of that, and Florida has been an example of that. And so you see states like those and others who are going directly to the people and allowing the people to decide what their law should be on women's health care. And that's vital. To your question, though, Sree, unfortunately, no, not all of us do have that. I live in a state where our ballot initiative process was taken away by the Supreme Court over a technicality a few years ago. Coincidentally, it was right after our organization and several partner groups had filed to put Medicaid expansion on the ballot. There are about 10 states, if you can believe it, who have still not expanded Medicaid, which is a no-brainer, provides health insurance to people who otherwise couldn't afford it. And when we filed that, it was only a few days later that the Supreme Court took the ballot initiative process away. And so in Mississippi and several other states across the country, we are working to restore that process. But I'm grateful for friends like the one we just heard from in Missouri and people who are voting in Florida, that it is that those ballot initiatives do exist in some places and people are taking advantage of them. And that's another thing that can draw people out. We talked about the presidential race. That can be a draw. People do seem to get excited when they know that they can go and vote and create a law themselves that could change the quality of life or the healthcare landscape for their state.
Yeah,
Thank
we
you.
have a tricky initiative in North Carolina that whenever it's on any ballot, it gets approved, which says that if you are not a citizen, you can't vote in a federal election. But actually, the paper and others have been asking folks to vote no, because they're saying it's deceptive. It sounds perfectly reasonable, but it can be used perhaps to curtail voting rights by the legislature down the line. And we have one of those legislatures that is a super majority for Republicans. That happened because a woman representative in the state legislature, Tricia Cotham, was elected as a Democrat. And she changed her party and immediately gave the Republicans the supermajority. And that's why people are looking at those state legislature votes, as Brandon said, because they matter. And whether we had a Democratic governor who would veto a lot of these laws, like the stricter abortion ban and others, but then that would be overridden by the legislature. So you really have to look at these initiatives very carefully and study them and make sure they say, things, what they say, they say. It's quite interesting.
Thank you, folks. We have about 20 minutes left with Mary and Brandon, and we're talking about down ballot races, but we're happy to answer your questions about anything political. We want to remind you that we're having more election coverage. Tonight is election eve in the United States. Tomorrow is election day, and we want to remind you of what's coming up. So we're going to show you that we are going to be live at noon Eastern time, which is at 10:30 p.m. in India. And then we'll be live at 9 p.m., which will be Wednesday at 7:30 a.m. And then we'll have a 1-hour show at 11 p.m. Eastern time, just as some of the most important polls are closing, when we will present Indian Express U.S. election show, and it is called America Decides. And so we want you to join us for that show. That's Tuesday night at 11 p.m. and Wednesday morning in India. And you can do the math for the rest of the world. Europe, I know people will be getting up, because I was in Europe when that famous first and only debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump took place. And I woke up to try to pay attention to what was going on. So thank you, everybody, for watching now. But please mark your calendars so you can join us tomorrow for those races as well. So we have only a little bit of time, so we want to get through some questions. Apollo asks, that old electoral college every 4 years, it's the measured momentum of controlled revolution. How do you like that? That's almost poetry from Apollo. It's a fervent prayer that it delivers for Kamala. Now, poetry aside, Brandon, your thoughts on the Electoral College. The reason it exists, we know, is so that the states can have equal say in the Senate and other parts of the government. But your thoughts about the Electoral College?
Well, the history of the Electoral College in the United States is not unlike the history of so many things, and it was primarily to lock in the political power of white men. It offends everything that we think about in terms of fairness. And in most places, when we vote, we assume that the people who get the most votes would be the person who's elected. It's a little confounding. It takes places like Mississippi and Missouri, Arkansas, voters in states across the country, and minimizes the vote of those individuals. I think it'd be better for all of us and better for our leadership if folks who got the most votes were the ones who attained office. And we already live, as I've mentioned several times, in these deeply gerrymandered states, many of us. And so it would be nice to have a true voice in selecting the president of your country. The Electoral College is a bit of a handicap to that.
Thank you, folks. I'm Sree Sreenivasan, Mary C. Curtis, Brandon Jones. We're answering your questions about all things to do with the elections, though we're focusing on down ballot races. I'm going to ask our producer, Neil Parekh, to put back on the screen the endorsements list that Brandon put in, and I want to hear Mary's thoughts as we look at the coroner, we look at various board level seats, district judges, school board district. What does this say about the state of democracy, Mary, when you see this? Some people look at this and say, isn't it great that you can vote for these people? And then others will be very upset seeing this and all the shenanigans that can take place. Mary.
Well, I hosted not too long ago a panel on voting and voting in North Carolina. And one of the panelists was a county commissioner. And he said how difficult it was to get people to care about some of them. And then he had to ask them, when someone dies and you need a death certificate, you go to this county clerk. Who is this person? What do you need to do? So a lot of it has to do with civics education that I think that we need more of in this country, in our schools, that we actually know what all of these people do and how important it is to your day-to-day life. I always like to say, when people say, I'm not interested in politics, and I always say, well, politics is interested in you. Everything that happens in your life, these little decisions you have to make, and things like this, when you have an elderly parent and you need some help getting some red tape, cut, who do you go to? How can you get this done? And so it's great that we are able to do this and vote for these folks. But at the same time, I think that a lot of people really need to understand just how much this can either help you in your daily life or gum it up. And, so many of these jobs, they're talking now that if Donald Trump gets elected, he will take a lot of expertise out of the field and put in political appointments. And when that happens, well, people who don't have expertise in this field, people who don't have experience in the fields, things won't happen that need to happen. And that's why we really need to do research on every candidate. And that's the difficulty of people who are on Team Red or Team Blue and really just trust that everything will be okay, because it won't.
Brandon, this is the question. How do you get people to care about these smaller races when so many people don't even care about the presidential race, the one that gets all the attention? So what are some of the ways in which SPLC Action Fund is able to drive attention and make sure that people turn out to vote?
Well, Mary, I think we want to clip what Mary just said and maybe use that in some of our voter education. That was a pretty good commercial. But, think about it this way. If you go to get your car tag, or if you need to get married, or if you need to get divorced, or if you need to have a family member, get some much needed assistance because of whatever stage of life they may be in. If you have a pothole in front of your house or on your way to work, if you have an issue with a local hospital, drinking water, things like your library in your local community, access to all of those things I just mentioned runs through local officials. And the way that money is given out within your community to fund certain projects or not fund certain projects, that all comes from your local community. I don't want to understate the importance of our federal elections. I'm one of those people who thinks democracy is on the ballot this year. But when it comes to some of the basic things that we rely on in our lives, local officials are vital. It is amazing the amount of decisions that are made right in your own backyard. And so our appeal to people is to, learn more about what these people do, to give some thought about how important those roles are in their life, and to really be thoughtful and critical and engaging. And so that's the pitch we make, Sree. It doesn't always work, but we're continuing to make it. And it's going to take a little bit of time. The truth is, we've probably been a little bit delinquent in highlighting the importance of these local political races, and we're trying to make up some of that ground.
Thank you. Apollo says, I canvassed and some young Black men argue for Trump. My return, Trump doesn't give an F about you. We'll see what happens, because it's certainly misogyny. That is certainly one of the things that's happening. Apollo also asked about the race and asked if how much the early voting rates are different today versus 2020. And the fact is that in 2020, it was at an all-time high. 110 million people voted early because of the pandemic, because of the ability for them to vote without going into going to the polling places. This year, those rates are down. So we still don't know what that means in terms of who will win. But Mary, I know you've paid close attention to the early voting trends.
Yes, and there's a trend that folks are saying that Republicans are voting at a much earlier, at a much higher rate for early voting, because usually Democrats do that, and they have the lead. And they're saying, does this mean that Trump is ahead? Well, the thing of it is, remember that Trump used to say that don't vote early, vote on election day. You can't trust mail-in or early voting. And then he changed his tune. So this year he asked a lot of Republicans, you've got to go out and vote early. So folks are wondering, well, does that mean that it's a cannibalization of the election day vote, and that there'll be fewer Republicans voting on election day because more are heeding Trump? Others are saying, is there a secret Republicans for Kamala Harris voting going on there, particularly among Republican women? So even though it's up and Republicans are voting at a much more even rate than Democrats in this year, it's still, I think, difficult and a little dangerous to try to draw too much out of it.
Sure, thank you. We're just going to go through some comments. Aisha says, my prediction is that Missouri voters will vote to overturn the GOP's extreme abortion ban, and our supermajority GOP-controlled state legislature will do everything in its power to overturn the will of the people via endless legal challenges. Even when we vote to restore reproductive rights, it will be the start of a long fight to truly restore what we've had taken from us. Thank you, Aisha. Everyone, please find Aisha's very important columns on politics, society, and so much more on the St. Louis Post-Dispatch website. Diana asks, what resources do you suggest that help make people care more about down-ballot races, especially school boards? Is there a podcast, book, or report that the general public should know about? So let's go to Brandon with that question.
Yeah, well, we have two websites that I'll point to that we post resources on and updates on some of our work, and those can be gateways into some of that information. The SPLCactionfund.org, that is our C4's website. There you can see work that's taking place in the state, and it touches on virtually every issue we've talked about tonight. And then our Super PAC, where we run our independent expenditures on behalf of campaigns, that can be found at newsouthernmajority.org. So I would certainly point people there. And there are so many websites and books and resources. I would screw up if I mentioned some without others. So maybe that's something I'll provide to our friends here at the show for posting later. But we try to keep people up to speed with some of that information and through our socials. And there's some information about podcasts and others that way too.
Thank you. Mary, your thoughts on how to drive people to care about school boards, where you're hearing that the right-wing extremists have taken over school boards, even in blue states. And I will also note that the conservative movement understood the value of judicial races, understood the value of seeding, SEEDING, seeding the judicial system so that one day they could end up with a 6-3 majority, which they have now in the Supreme Court. And so whereas a lot of Democrats seem to be focused on the Senate, Congress, and the presidential election, these grassroots right-wing folks who are often not grassroots but supported by big corporations, they have a way in which they have gotten onto these much smaller platforms, seemingly smaller platforms, Mary.
Yeah, and you saw how the 6-3 Supreme Court took the case of Virginia and let them take 1,600 people off the voter rolls, even though it's this close to the election. And everyone was saying that really does seem to be a contradiction of the federal voting rules, but they did that. You know, as a journalist, I get so much information from great local papers. You just don't go to the Washington Post and the New York Times. It's been, to me, just so sad how so many of our local papers have folded. And so a lot of people turn to the national news or national that don't do that on the ground, wonderful reporting. And we've seen some independent places like ProPublica and others do great investigations. I believe, they're doing some great stuff. They've done some good reporting. I think they reported in Georgia on the two women who died as complications from the strict abortion ban. But it's just much more difficult now. And even local television stations, it's tough because you have groups like Sinclair buying up a bunch of them and insisting that they have certain kind of editorials on them. So you have to be a careful reader of these organizations to see how independent they are. But I'm not going to get in here. I'm still going to recommend that, great local papers to see what's going on in the individual states, because you can't always depend on the national organizations and the national newspapers and networks to do it.
Well, let's underline that by pointing out that 2,900 newspapers have shut down in the United States in the last 20 years. 2,900 newspapers means not only are this kinds of information not available easily, but those news deserts that are created can cause real problems in non-political items as well, and non-political issues as well. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask Brandon to give us his final thoughts and how he's going to spend tomorrow, and then we'll get a final thought from Mary as well.
Well, it's been a real pleasure to be with both of you tonight and to talk about these important issues. Frankly, it's good to have something to do. Anxiety is high, and it's nice to just be together with good people. Tomorrow, I'm going to spend some time volunteering. I'm an attorney by trade, and so one of the things that I like to do is be one of those lawyers that's taking calls from polling places to assist with people who are having issues. So I'm looking forward to doing that, and excited to make sure people have access to the vote.
Thank you for doing that. What a great way to spend election day. Mary, to you.
Well, and I'm going to vote. It will be election day, 6:30. The polls open. My husband and I will probably be there. And I do this in honor of my mother, who was an elections worker. She was in charge of many elections workers, and she would have to go to all of the different precincts and polling places on election day to make sure there was a Democrat and a Republican, and everything was set up accordingly. So it was almost sacred to us. And that's the way I feel. So my final word is I'm the youngest of 5 kids, and my 3 older siblings were involved in the civil rights movement in very active ways. And to me, when people say I can't be bothered to vote, or it's raining, or it won't make a difference, I tell you, if it's just dog catcher and there's one person on the ballot, I vote, because I think of John Lewis and Medgar Evers and folks like that who really fought and died in many cases for my right to vote. And John Lewis, the late congressman, who when he was in his 20s was walking across that bridge, with his little backpack, getting beaten. And then he became a congressman. And near the end of his life, he still was fighting after the overturning of some of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act, but he still fought. He was a joyful warrior, but he fought. So I would just tell folks, think of all the people that made sacrifices to make democracy work in a more equal way, and let that be your inspiration, because it surely is mine.
Oh, what a beautiful way to end this show. Folks, you've been listening to Brandon Jones, SPLC Action Fund, Mary C. Curtis, wonderful commentator in French. You'll be back with us tomorrow. Let's remind you of the shows we have coming up. We have a show at noon Eastern time tomorrow, which is in India at 10:30 p.m. on Tuesday, Election Day. And then on Tuesday night, we will also be live at 9 p.m. and 11 p.m. And that means we'll be live on Wednesday morning in India, where you will be able to watch our shows. We will also be live for 1 hour at 11 p.m. right after the major polls close for America Decides, live from New York, where we will talk about the elections for the Indian Express. I am very grateful to everyone who's watched. Please tag a friend. Please vote. Please make your plans to vote. I will be voting tomorrow, 6 a.m., round the corner from here, standing in line, excited to be able to do something that we can do in this country and so many countries around the world. We are very grateful for the opportunity for all of us to vote. Diana says, great show. Thank you for talking about these important races. Keep up the good work. Thank you, Mary, Brandon, Sree, and Neil. Thank you very much. Incredible program. Wow, Jonathan, thank you so much. We're very grateful to you. And Bob says, excellent show. On to Tuesday. And I noticed that Rose Horowitz, who is our friend who runs the Women to Follow hashtag, she's talking about women about journalists losing jobs, and she's quoting Margaret Sullivan, who is a astute commentator on the media. So with that, we will thank everyone again for watching. Thank you, Marion and Brandon. Hard work is good work. Joyful warriors. We appreciate you all very much, and we will see you again on these election shows. Thank you very much, and please reach out if you have any questions or comments. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon. Bye.